What would you do if the thing everyone said was cursed turned out to be the only honest thing left in town? We want to tell you about a young woman named Celia Brandt, and about the winter the frozen lake gave up a secret it had been keeping for 80 years. Celia arrived in the village of Harrow's Crossing, Ontario, on the coldest morning of November, with a canvas bag over one shoulder and her late teacher's leather punch cinched to her belt like a talisman. She was 22 years old. She had $14.30, a pair of boots that had begun to separate at the left heel, and the kind of quiet that settles into a person after they have cried everything out and have nothing left to spend on grief. Her teacher, a woman named Miss Eunice Faber, had died in September, a schoolteacher who had also been a cobbler's daughter, who had kept a small workbench in her back room and taught Celia, her only apprentice, how to read leather the way other people read books. The leather punch, brass-barreled, worn smooth at the handle, had been in Miss Faber's family for 40 years before it passed to Celia's palm. When the landlord cleared the house, he kept the tools. Celia kept the punch. It was all she had managed to carry out before the door was locked behind her. She had no family to speak of. Her mother had passed when she was 9. Her father had remarried and made it quietly, firmly clear, through years of turned backs and unanswered letters, that there was no longer a place for her at his table. So Celia had made herself small and useful in Miss Faber's orbit for 3 years, learning a trade, earning her keep, believing that was enough. It was not enough. After the funeral, after the estate was settled, the house and the workshop and the tools all went to a nephew in Hamilton who had never once visited. Celia was left with a name she couldn't spend, a skill no one in the city seemed to need, and the hollow understanding that she had built her whole life inside someone else's house. Harrow's Crossing was not her destination so much as it was the end of her money. The bus had stopped there, and she had not had the fare to go further. She stepped off into a wind that came off the lake like something personal, like the cold had been waiting for her specifically. The village was a stubborn little place tucked between a granite ridgeline and the eastern shore of Lake Corrigan, a wide, shallow lake that froze solid by mid-December and stayed that way until April. There was a feed store, a hardware shop, a church with a roof that needed mending, and a tavern called the Corrigan Arms that seemed to do the steadiest business of anything in town. A single main road ran through and then out again, heading nowhere faster than it had come. The people who lived there had the look of those who had long ago decided that leaving was more trouble than staying. Celia found lodging above the hardware store, in a room that smelled of machine oil and old newspapers, rented to her by a man named Mr. Clifford Rook, who ran the shop below and charged her next to nothing on the condition that she could mend his work gloves, his horse's harness, and anything else that came through made of leather. She agreed. She had no other offers. The townspeople noticed her the way small towns notice any newcomer, completely and without appearing to. She was young and alone and quiet, which in Harrow's Crossing meant she was either fleeing something or had already lost it. The women at the church took turns bringing her soup she hadn't asked for. The men at the Arms discussed her in the specific way that men discuss things they've decided are none of their business but intend to make so. She heard, in the fragments of conversation that reached her, that she was a curiosity. A girl with a cobbler's bench and no cobbler's shop. Pretty enough, someone said, but not the sort to make trouble. That last part seemed to satisfy everyone. She was filed away as harmless and left more or less alone, which was precisely what she needed. She set up her small workspace on a table by the single window of her room, where the winter light came in flat and gray and honest. She repaired what Mr. Clifford Rook brought her, and word spread the way it does in small places. By December she had enough work to cover her rent and eat 2 meals a day. It was not comfort, but it was not nothing either. She kept her hands busy, because her hands, at least, she could trust. The repetitive motion of pushing the punch through hide, of pulling thread through the eye of a needle, was the one thing that settled her mind when everything else felt like standing water going nowhere. The village sat quiet under its first heavy snowfall in the second week of December, and Celia sat in her room and listened to the wind come off Lake Corrigan and felt, for the first time in months, something almost like stillness. The ice came early that year. By the 3rd week of December, Lake Corrigan had frozen over completely, a sheet of gray-white stretching all the way to the tree line on the far shore. The old men at the Corrigan Arms talked about it like they talked about everything, with the low, satisfied certainty of people who know the weather personally. It had been a dry autumn, they said. Cold came in hard. The ice would be thick by Christmas, thick enough to drive a truck on, which several of them intended to do. It was one of those old men, a retired trapper named August Kehoe, who came into the hardware store once a week for reasons that seemed more social than practical, who first mentioned the story of the Corrigan boat. He told it the way you tell something you have told 100 times, leaning back in his chair while Mr. Clifford Rook pretended not to listen, and Celia pretended to be entirely absorbed in stitching a bridle. The Corrigan family, August said, had owned the sawmill on the north end of the lake from sometime in the 1890s until the mill burned in 1943. They'd been the closest thing Harrow's Crossing had ever had to wealth, or to a dynasty, depending on who you asked. The patriarch, a man named Aldrich Corrigan, for whom the lake itself was named, had run the operation with his 2 sons for decades. In the winter of 1941, before the mill fire, a supply boat, a flat-bottomed workboat the family used to ferry timber across the lake, had gone through the ice during an early thaw. 2 men had been on it. One had made it to shore. The other had not. The boat, and whatever it was carrying, had gone straight to the bottom. What was it carrying? Celia asked, because she couldn't help it. August looked at her with the mildly satisfied expression of a man who had been waiting for that exact question. The Corrigan payroll, he said. Cash. Wages for the mill workers, brought in by courier from the bank in Copper Falls. Somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000, depending on which version of the story you'd heard. The family had reported it lost. The insurance claim had been paid. The mill burned 2 years later, and Aldrich Corrigan was dead by 1950. And the money, if there'd ever really been a money, had stayed at the bottom of Lake Corrigan for 80 years, frozen in the dark under 50 feet of water and 2 feet of ice. Nobody had ever gone looking for it? Not seriously, August said. The lake was deep in the middle, and there'd been no way to know where exactly the boat had gone down. Besides, he added, with the slow deliberateness of a man delivering a punchline he's earned, the Corrigan family had never seemed especially interested in anyone else looking. Which was a thing, he said, that had always struck him as interesting, considering. He left it there, the way old men do, and shuffled out into the cold. Celia set down the bridle and looked out the window at the frozen lake. She thought about the punch on her belt, and Miss Faber's voice telling her that the most important thing a craftsperson could do was pay attention to what didn't belong. An uneven stitch. A seam that pulled the wrong way. A detail that refused to fit the pattern of everything else. She thought, why would a family not want their missing money found? She did not say this to anyone. She only looked at the lake and felt the question settle into her the way cold settles into a house, quietly, and from every direction at once. It was January before the answer began to come to her, and it came the way most answers come, sideways, through a door she hadn't expected. A woman named Mrs. Dorothea Flagg ran the small lending library out of the back room of the church. She was 81 years old, moved like someone who had made her peace with gravity, and had the quality of a person who had been paying close attention to her surroundings for 8 decades and found it all tremendously interesting. When Celia came in one afternoon looking for something to read and stayed to help sort donations, they fell into the easy conversation of people who are each surprised to find someone worth talking to. It was Mrs. Dorothea Flagg who mentioned, without apparent awareness of what she was handing over, that the Corrigan family had donated their old business records to the library in 1965, and that they were in 3 cardboard boxes in the back room that nobody had opened since. Celia asked if she might look at them. Mrs. Dorothea Flagg said that she couldn't imagine why anyone would want to. But yes, of course. The boxes smelled of mildew and the specific dust of things left unopened too long. Celia went through them over 3 evenings, sitting at the library table while Mrs. Dorothea Flagg read nearby and the wind knocked at the church windows. Most of it was dull. Supply manifests, lumber tallies, correspondence about board feet and freight costs. But in the second box, tucked between a bundle of fuel invoices and a 1939 calendar, she found a ledger. It was not a payroll ledger. It was something more careful than that. The entries were dated between 1938 and 1942, written in a cramped, precise hand, and they recorded transactions that had nothing to do with timber. Cash payments, unnamed, to a series of initials. Deposits made in amounts that corresponded, when Celia sat down and worked it out slowly on a piece of paper, to the wages of mill workers who, according to the separate payroll records in the third box, had been listed as having worked full shifts, but who appeared in 2 different local newspapers from the same period, in the death notices. Dead men collecting wages. And the wages, collected month after month for 4 years, added up to a number very close to the amount reported lost when the supply boat went through the ice. Celia sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The money had never been on the boat, or perhaps some of it had, and the rest had been siphoned off in plain sight for years, paid out to men who were already dead, pocketed by whoever was signing the ledger. The boat going through the ice might have been an accident, or it might have been the most convenient accident imaginable. She wrapped the ledger in her scarf and carried it home under her coat. She needed someone to help her understand what she had, and she needed someone she could trust. In Harrow's Crossing, that was a short list. She thought about Mr. Clifford Rook, but he was friendly with half the town council, and she didn't know yet what the town council had to do with any of this. She thought about August Kehoe, who knew the story and seemed to find something satisfying in the family's oddness. But August talked, and she wasn't ready for this to be a story yet. There was one name she'd heard mentioned carefully, the way you mention something you respect but are cautious around. A man named Howard Crest, who ran the ice road equipment out of a shed on the South Shore and did seasonal work for the township. He was a licensed diver in the summer months. He had, according to Mrs. Dorothea Flagg, found a drowned snowmobile and returned it to its owner without saying a word to anyone about where he'd found it or why he'd been looking. He was known for being the sort of person who finished what he started and kept his mouth shut about the rest. Celia found him at his shed on a Wednesday morning, adjusting the engine of an ice auger. She waited until he'd finished, then told him what she had found. She showed him the ledger. She told him what she thought it meant. He listened without interrupting, his eyes on the pages, his face giving nothing away. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He set the ledger down on his workbench and looked at her. He said, "You understand who owns this town's hockey arena, the new community center, and 3 of the 4 seats on the planning committee?" She said she did not. He said, "The Corrigan grandchildren." He looked at the ledger again. He looked at her. He said, "How cold are you comfortable being?" She said, "Colder than I am now." He nodded once. "Give me 3 days," he said. "I need to look at the ice conditions and find the original survey maps for the lake floor. If the boat is where I think it is, we might be able to confirm the cargo without going all the way to the bottom. But you follow my lead, no talking to anyone until we know what we have," she agreed. She walked back to the hardware store in the dark, the cold air filling her lungs, and felt, for the first time since November, that she was moving towards something rather than simply away from it. What Howard Crest had not told her, and what she would only understand later, was that he had his own reasons for wanting to know the truth about the Corrigan money. His grandfather had been a mill worker, one of the names in the ledger's death notices. One of the men whose wages had continued to be collected after his burial had the same surname. He didn't say this. He simply showed up on Saturday morning with 2 sets of cold water gear, a hand auger, and a sonar unit he borrowed from a cousin in Sudbury. He was thorough and methodical, and he treated her questions like reasonable ones, which no one in Harrow's Crossing had entirely done before. They worked from the south ice, away from the village's sight lines, in the early mornings before the light drew attention. Howard Crest had the survey maps and the 1941 newspapers, and he had triangulated a search area on the northwestern quadrant of the lake, where the ice over a submerged shelf dropped away sharply into deeper water. He drove the auger while Celia hauled gear and watched the sonar read out. A skill she learned from him in 20 minutes because she was precise with her hands and she paid attention. The lake gave nothing up on the first morning, or the second. On the third morning, in a thin gray light with the temperature sitting at -24, the sonar returns changed. Howard Crest looked at the readout and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "There's something there." It wasn't a treasure chest. It was a shape, rectangular, flat-bottomed, the dimensions consistent with a 12-foot workboat, sitting on the shelf ledge at 38 feet, tilted slightly to one side. Intact, 80 years in cold, fresh water had kept it from disappearing entirely. Celia stood on the ice and looked at the sonar readout and felt her chest do something strange. She had found it, or rather, they had found it. But the important thing, the thing that the ledger had already told her, was that the boat being there, intact with its cargo, did not prove a theft. It proved a lie. If the boat had gone through the ice carrying the payroll in 1941 and the insurance company had paid the claim and the money was still down there, then either the insurance claim was fraudulent or the money in the boat was never the real payroll at all, but a staged loss designed to cover the years of systematic theft the ledger had recorded. Either way, the Corrigan family had taken money that belonged to the workers of that mill, the dead men's families. The living men who had labored there and been shorted for years while someone pocketed what should have been their wages. It was not $4,000. At 80 years of interest, Celia had worked out on a piece of paper that the original stolen amount, compounded conservatively, was closer to something that would change lives. She had done all of this mathematics sitting on her bed in the room above the hardware store, with the leather punch on the table beside her, and she thought about Miss Faber saying, "You need to be precise. Precision is not about perfection. It's about being honest with the material." They came back from the ice on that third morning and sat in Howard Crest's shed with 2 mugs of tea and the ledger between them on the workbench. He said, "What do you want to do with this?" she said. "I want to make sure it goes to the right people." She thought for a moment. "I don't want to be the one who carries it alone." He nodded. He reached under his workbench and pulled out a file folder. Inside were photocopies, documents he had been collecting, quietly for some time. Employment records from the mill's provincial filings, which he had requested through an access to information process 3 years ago, out of simple curiosity about his grandfather's estate. The records matched the death notices. The records did not match the Corrigan payroll ledger. He had not known what to do with it before. He had not had the piece that explained it. Celia looked at his file and then at him. "You've had this for 3 years, she said. "I didn't have the ledger," he said simply. There was a long pause. Outside, the wind came off the lake and rattled the shed door. Celia thought about the family whose name was on the arena, the family whose grandchildren sat on the planning committee, the ease with which money that old, buried that deep, could simply be allowed to stay buried. She thought about Miss Faber, who had lived her whole life making things right and careful and true, who had died with $14 in her account, and a nephew in Hamilton who'd never visited. She said, "We take it to the provincial police, not the local detachment, the district office in Copper Falls." Howard Crest looked at her steadily. "That's going to make some people very unhappy," he said. "I expect so," Celia said. He picked up his tea. "All right," he said. "I'll drive." What happened next was not fast, and it was not clean, and it was not the kind of thing that resolves itself in an afternoon. "We want to be honest with you about that." The investigation took 8 months. The Corrigan grandchildren hired lawyers immediately, and the lawyers were very good lawyers, the kind that small towns do not usually have access to. The community center was renamed 3 times in the papers before anyone had decided anything official. People in Harrow's crossing took sides, not always the sides you'd expect. Some of the oldest families, the ones who had worked the mill, were the quietest because they had children and grandchildren who depended on the Corrigan businesses, and saying what they knew out loud felt like burning down the house they lived in. But the ledger was specific, and Howard Crest's provincial records were specific, and the boat was on the bottom of the lake, and the cargo it carried was eventually raised and documented and confirmed. 80 years of sitting in cold fresh water had preserved more than anyone expected. The insurance fraud was unambiguous. The wage theft was unambiguous. And the amounts, when calculated with the appropriate interest over 80 years, represented a figure that the court was owed to the estates of the original mill workers, or, where those estates were untraceable, to a workers' heritage trust the provincial government established for exactly this purpose. The Corrigan grandchildren did not go to prison. The statute of limitations on the original crime had long since passed, and their grandfather was 80 years dead. But the civil judgment against the family trust was substantial. The planning committee seats were resigned. The arena was renamed. For real this time, for an indigenous trapper's family who had worked that land long before any Corrigan had arrived. And the ledger, along with Howard Crest's file and a written account provided by Celia, went into the provincial archives where they would stay available to anyone who wanted to look. August Coe, when he heard what had come of his story about the Corrigan boat, sat down in the chair at the hardware store and was quiet for a while. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Well, I always thought there was something to that." Mr. Clifford Rook, to his credit, said very little publicly, but gave Celia a rent reduction she had not asked for, and replaced the window in her room with one that actually sealed against the wind. The thing that stayed with Celia in the months after, the thing she turned over and kept returning to, was not the ledger, and not the boat, and not the particular satisfaction of watching the truth come out after 80 years of cold and silence. It was the afternoon in the shed when she had told Howard Crest what she'd found, and he had listened to all of it without interrupting, and then asked one single practical question. Not, "Are you sure?" Not who sent you. Not the particular flavor of dismissal that she had grown so familiar with, the one that came wrapped in kindness and dressed as concern. Just, How cold are you comfortable being? She had spent the years since Miss Faber's death believing that the thing she needed most was a place of her own. 4 walls that were hers, work that was reliable, ground that couldn't be taken. She found those things eventually. She used a portion of the finder's recognition, a formal acknowledgement, and a modest award from the Provincial Historical Society to set up a small workshop in a space she rented on the main road of Harrow's Crossing, 3 doors down from the Corrigan Arms, which by then had been sold and renamed. She repaired boots and saddlery and school bags and hockey gear, and she was good at it, and the town came to understand that. But the thing that mattered, the thing that changed the whole shape of what she'd believed her life was going to look like, had not been the workshop or the award. It had been the conversation in the cold, the moment of being believed. The leather punch still sat on her workbench. She used it every day. She thought of Miss Faber every time she picked it up. Precision is not about perfection, the old woman had said. It's about being honest with the material. Celia had found in the end that this was true of more than leather. Howard Crest came by the workshop on the day she opened it, with a bottle of decent wine and the 2 mugs from his shed, because he'd thought it was funnier than bringing proper glasses. He was right. They stood in the small space that smelled of fresh-cut wood and leather oil, and looked out the window at the frozen lake, which had given nothing more away since January and showed no sign of starting now. He raised his mug. She raised hers. Outside, Harrow's Crossing went on the way it always had, quietly, stubbornly, in the particular way of places that have decided they are staying. But under the ice of Lake Corrigan, the shelf where the boat had rested was empty now. The long-held secret was gone. What replaced it was only water, clear and cold, and without a thing left to hide. We think about Celia sometimes, and about the leather punch on her belt, and about the question she asked that November afternoon that started everything, the one she barely whispered to herself, standing at a window looking out at a frozen lake. Why would a family not want their missing money found? It wasn't a dramatic question. It wasn't a shout. It was the small, quiet kind, the kind that only matters if you're paying attention, and only changes things if you're willing to follow it somewhere cold. Tell us, in the comments below, have you ever noticed a detail that nobody else seemed to care about, and turned out to be the only one asking the right question? We'd love to hear your story. And if Celia's journey stayed with you, please leave a like. It means more than you know. There are always more stories out there of quiet people who refuse to let the truth stay buried. Don't miss the next one.